As our opening keynote speaker, it's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague and good friend, media theorist, Clay Shirky. Clay is the author of two terrific books. First, Here Comes Everybody, and a book called Cognitive Surplus, both with fresh, original ideas, and they're great books to read. And Clay has established himself as one of the world's leading thinkers about the role of the internet in business and society. He holds a joint appointment at New York University as Associate Arts Professor of the Interactive Telecommunications Program, and he's also a distinguished writer in residence in the journalism department. He's a fellow at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard, and was the Edward R. Murrow Visiting Lecturer at Harvard's John Shorenstein Center of the Press, Politics, and Public Policy in 2010. Over the years, his works have been broadcast and published in many media, and he's also written for many mainstream publications, including Wired, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Policy magazine. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Clay Shirky.
Mesdames, Messieurs, bonjour. My français c'est pas si bon, so je fais this talk in English, sorry. But it's a delight to be in Montreal, as always. And thank you, Don, for that very kind introduction. As you mentioned, I've written a couple of books on social media. They're smaller if you get them in the store, so don't be alarmed. Here Comes Everybody, which is essentially a survey of how we got here. How did we get to a world where social media was changing the way people come together, find each other, share things, get things done. And Cognitive Surplus, which is a forward look, says essentially if we take for granted that this change in the media environment constitutes a new resource, what can we do with it? So, two books, 140,000 words, more or less. I'll give you the 5-word summary. Group action just got easier. The thesis common to both books is that the change in the media landscape has given us new tools not just for communicative action, which we're used to from the media environment, but new tools for coordinated action, new tools for cooperation, new tools for collaboration. And rather than talk about that in the abstract, let me just start with a story that I think illustrates some of what's changed. And the story starts here. This is a photo from Mangalore, India, from a couple of years ago. In January, a group of women out of an evening for a drink were set on in a pub by a group of men who grabbed them, dragged them from the pub, bodily pushed them into the streets. When other men stepped in, fist fights broke out, and as is by now usual, the whole thing was documented on camera phones, photos and videos being taken and then uploaded to Flickr and YouTube, and made their way from there to mainstream Indian media. Shortly after that happened, this guy appeared, Pramod Mutalik, who's the leader of a Hindu fundamentalist group called Sri Ram Sini, Lord Ram's army. And Mutalik said, we attacked those women. We attacked them because they were not being sufficiently chaste. We attacked them because they were not being sufficiently private. We attacked them because they were not living up to our idea of Hindu womanhood. And we're going to do it again on Valentine's Day. If you were a woman in Mangalore province and we catch you out of doors on the 14th of February with a man who is not your relative, we will attack you again. So this leaves the women of Mangalore province with a collective action dilemma. All of the women together want this to fail. They do not want to be constrained to their homes. They do not want to be told who they can and can't associate with, whether they can or can't go out of doors. But each woman has to make the calculation that if they turn out, will there be enough strength in numbers, or will they be risking an attack if they show up on that day? And of course, the calculation then becomes, well, maybe everybody else will turn out and I can just stay home. And of course, this grim logic, sometimes called the logic of collective action, sometimes called the tragedy of the commons, explain why groups of people who could create shared value together often fail to. It's a significant coordination problem. But at the time of this attack, there was another option besides letting each individual woman make the decision, stay out or go home. And that option was to solve collective action dilemmas collectively. So this woman, Nisha Susan, a journalist working in Mangalore, decided that she was going to try this new option. She created a Facebook group called the Consortium of Loose, Forward, and Pub-Going Women. A very popular Facebook group, as you might imagine. Thousands of people joined. And then they announced their first and what became their only action, which is that they proposed to give Sri Ramsini an underwear upgrade. Right? The members of Sri Ramsini were sometimes called chadiwalas, underpants wearers, because they favored a style of khaki shorts that looked a little bit like diapers. So the women in the Consortium of Loose, Forward, and Pub-Going Women went and bought frilly pink underthings and would write a little message to Pramod Mutalik on the back, fold it up, put it in an envelope, and mail it physically to Sri Ramsini's headquarters. And of course, the media had a field day with this. Right? This generated an enormous amount of attention. It highlighted the issue. It highlighted the attack. And because it was so visible, it changed the equation. It changed the political conversation in that environment. And you can see immediately what happened, right? Which is that Susan provided a way for the distributed group of women, all of whom had shared preferences, to manifest those preferences publicly. And when they did, they made it easier for the government to see that there was a large group of people who had a particular need, in this case a need for safety. And the government then acted. They arrested Mutalik and several of his lieutenants as a result of this attack. And they just happened to arrest them on February 13th, so that they were in state custody on Valentine's Day, and there were no attacks that year. And that ability to turn the media landscape from a purely communicative landscape into something where groups of people can actually use media to coordinate their actions, that's what's changed. Right? When the newspapers, when the television, when the radio reported on the attack, all they could say was, Sri Ramsini is attacking women in Mangalore. Thought you'd like to know. What Nisha Susan was able to do with the Consortium of Loose, Forward, and Pub-Going Women was to say, Sri Ramsini is attacking women in Mangalore. Thought you'd like to know. Here's something you can do about it. Won't you join us? And that change is transformative. So here's that same story told again entirely diagrammatically. This is the media landscape I grew up in. It's the media landscape many of you grew up in, where a small number of organizations could create multiple identical copies of the same message and distribute it to users, consumers, citizens, what have you, at the edges of the network. And those citizens couldn't talk back, and they couldn't coordinate with one another. This is how the media landscape worked. This is just what media was in the 20th century. This is how it worked whether or not you owned a printing press or a broadcast tower. It's how it worked whether you were making movies or music or magazines. It is this environment that the internet disrupts. The first of the changes is these, right? People now have a public voice. They can now talk back. The arrow that we're used to being one way is now two-way. Every time you buy a phone or a computer, you are not just adding one consumer to the information environment, you are also adding one producer. Contrast buying a book or a television where you are not also getting the capabilities of a printing press or a broadcast tower. And that's a big deal. But that's not where the freakouts are coming from. The really big changes are coming from here. They're coming from the fact that any two people connected to this grid can now talk directly to one another, no professionals anywhere in sight. And there are way more green lines than red lines. And that's not technology. That's just math. It's just how networks work. The connected world is now not just much larger than it used to be, which is obvious. It is also unbelievably much denser. The web of relationships between people connected to one another on the grid we have been building on top of the internet, mobile phones, the applications built on top of them, is now not just more enormous than it used to be. It is enormously more complicated. Now, in this environment, in the traditional organizations have the ability to make multiple identical copies of a message. Right? Media was managed through hierarchy. Right? There was a set of decisions. There was a set of orders. This was a filter, then publish environment. Someone would decide this message is good to send out. We will option this author. We will greenlight this movie. We will produce this piece of music. Out here, though, where the people are, you can't manage that way any longer, in part because these people aren't workers, so they can't be managed as employees, and in part because they're not all part of the same organization. Out here, where the people are, what's driving the media environment now is not hierarchy, but culture, cultural choices. And I want to emphasize something Don said earlier. It's that fact that means this medium can be whatever we make it. Because there isn't a single set of decisions that turns this medium into this thing or that thing. It is the cumulative cultural choices made by all of the participants. And the people who are finding the best use for these tools are finding a way to work with the culture of the users. This change, this ability to rely on a world where everyone can speak, right, now shifts us from a world of filter then publish, the world of the traditional media landscape, to a world of publish then filter, where anyone can say anything and you have to find the good stuff after the fact. It's this that search engines are built on, the requirement for a search engine in the web environment comes about for the need for an after-the-fact filter. It also means that one of the great challenges of the age is to find the information that's already publicly available, but has not yet been collated or made workable. This is one of the grand challenges of our age. What are the new techniques that we need to adopt to take on problems where the information we want is already out there, but it's difficult to find? So DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Administration of the United States, who, among other things, funded much of the early work on what became the Internet, decided to test this, decided to try and figure out, in this new environment, how would people come together and try to solve a problem. So they did this. They put up 10 red weather balloons around the United States. They tethered these balloons to the ground, helium balloons, so they were floating, big balloons. Every balloon was visible from some roadway or walkway, but only DARPA had this map. Only DARPA knew where all 10 were. And then they launched what they called the Red Balloon Challenge. And the Red Balloon Challenge was this. DARPA said, you have 30 days to find all 10 of these balloons. You can find them any way you like, use any tools at your disposal. Anyone who in the next 30 days can tell us the location of all 10 balloons to within a mile of their actual location wins the $40,000 prize. So a team at MIT saw this and said, we know how to take on this new challenge. We can solve this problem. The information is already out there, right? Someone has seen every balloon. So instead of finding the balloons, we have to turn our attention to finding the someones and to give them a reason to share that information with us. So they said, quite reasonably, well, we'll pay people to tell us where the balloons are. We'll say, if you tell us where a balloon is and we win the prize, we'll split the prize money with you. So now they've solved the information disclosure problem. Now they have a marketing problem. They have to launch a national ad campaign that has a target audience of 10 people. You could not do this in the 20th century using any available tools. You couldn't do it with TV ads. You couldn't do it with billboards. You could not do it in the newspaper. And yet this is the challenge that MIT faces. So then they say, oh, we know how to solve that. We'll pay you if you tell us where a balloon is. And we'll also pay you if you introduce us to someone who tells us where a balloon is. And we'll pay you if you introduce us to someone who introduces us to someone who tells us where a balloon is. And now there's an incentive for this message to spread. Right? Facebook lights up, Twitter lights up. Why not pass the message along? Probably you won't know anybody in that chain who eventually knows where the balloon is. But there's a very low cost of passing the message along, and maybe you'll get a little money out of it. There's three important things about this strategy to note. The first is the MIT team won. And here they are with their comically large check for $40,000. The second thing is that the MIT team, the top team there, was the only team to correctly find the location of all 10 balloons. They were the only people who actually completed the entirety of the challenge. But the third thing was the time. DARPA allotted 30 days for this challenge to unfold, and the MIT team solved it in 9 hours, which is to say DARPA over-provisioned the amount of time this might take by a factor of 80. This is a problem that could not have been solved with 20th century tools and is now rendered trivial. That's when things change. It's not when new tools make formerly hard problems easy. It's when new tools make formerly impossible problems trivial. And this ability to say, the information is out there, it's just widely dispersed, it's widely distributed, but now we have the tools to aggregate it and manifest it and make it visible and useful, that's one of the big changes of the age. End of 2007, in Kenya, there was a disputed presidential election. In the aftermath of this, in December, there was a terrible outbreak of ethnic violence. And this woman, Oria Kola, a lawyer living in Nairobi at the time, and was blogging about the ethnic violence. She was writing about how terrible this was, about what was happening, about where it was happening, and so forth. And this was the usual story in 2007, now heading into 2008, which is the mainstream media was writing about the ethnic violence. The bloggers were discussing it. It was the kind of mixed media landscape we were used to. And then the government announced media blackout. The Kenyan government said, no more reporting on the ethnic violence. No mainstream media can do this, including banning all use of live reporting in any medium. You could not put a microphone or a camera in front of someone and ask their opinion about anything live anymore. So afraid was the government that information about the ethnic violence might get out. And Akola and her blog became one of the primary sources of information, because although there was a mainstream media blackout, there was not a blackout of the blogosphere. And she began to post firsthand accounts from her commenters. People would come in, leave information. Sometimes she would write it up as a post. Sometimes she would just leave it in the comments. But even that was overwhelming. And after a few days of that, she said, I'm out. I can't do this anymore. I could do this 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and I still don't have enough time and attention to take in all this information. I wish there was some way to automate this. And a couple of programmers raised their hands in the comments and said, we could build that. And thus was Ushahidi born. The name means witness or testimony in Swahili. And Ushahidi is a platform for aggregating what everybody knows but is too widely distributed for anybody to act on. And Ushahidi is simplicity itself. If you see something, you send an SMS, you make a phone call, you send an email, and you identify the incident, you identify the location, and Ushahidi puts it on a map. But because it puts it on a public map and because it aggregates it, you start to be able to see hotspots. There's an outbreak of violence here. There have been attacks there. And in a study later done at Harvard on the accuracy of Ushahidi, they found out that not only was Ushahidi as accurate as the mainstream press, the non-Kenyan press reporting on this, but that Ushahidi did a better job of reporting on non-fatal ethnic attacks, which turned out to be an important precursor and predictor of later fatal ethnic attacks, because you could see the violence ramping up. Ushahidi, by aggregating the information from the individuals spread throughout Kenya, was able to produce better information than the mainstream press had access to. And this pattern has now been repeated many times. It's been used for election monitoring, where people build a new version put up a new version of Ushahidi and adapt the map for these purposes. It's been used to track snow removal in Washington, D.C., first world problems. It's been used to track both needs and presence of supplies in Haiti in the aftermath of the awful Port-au-Prince earthquake. It was used to track, the Haitian government then liked the service so much that they've adopted and turned it into an internally run tool. And most recently, or recently, it was used to track needs and supplies in the outbreak of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear accident, tsunami, earthquake in Japan. Right? I want to call your attention to three things about this tool for aggregating knowledge. The first is this. Anybody who thinks about the spread of particularly networked digital technologies is used to a sentence that goes something like this. This technology was invented in Mountain View, California, and it spread worldwide in 3 years. Right? That's a sentence we're used to writing. People who think about technology a lot have that sentence as a macro. We're not used to the sentence that says this technology was invented in Nairobi, Kenya, and it spread worldwide in 3 years. That's a new sentence. But it's possible now because the inventiveness that goes on in these kinds of environments is obviously part technological. You needed programmers who could figure out how this works. But it also requires significant social intuitions, which are much more broadly spread. Right? The ability to orchestrate the participants rather than just to arrange the technological tools is what makes Ushahidi work. As Eric Hirschman, one of the original programmers, has pointed out, all of the tools underlying Ushahidi have been sitting around for years. But Ushahidi did not happen. It was not a side effect of the availability of the tools. It required a design principle. Second thing I want to call your attention to. If you look at Ushahidi in the field, it looks very low tech, right? Because it's just people SMSing from their phones. This is not a service that requires everyone to have an iPhone 5. It just requires you to have a Nokia 1100, the simplest digital phone ever made. If you look at it from Ushahidi headquarters, it looks very high-tech. There are elaborate databases. It pipes to a Google map. It's building up a web service that provides all this information. So which is it, low-tech or high-tech? And the answer is yes. It's both. It's mixed tech. What Ushahidi realized is that you can build on what I've been calling a cantilever pattern, where you can create a service that creates an enormous amount of value for the participants, but the people at the center and the people at the edges don't have to have the same technology, which means you can start to create connective, collaborative value, not when people get high broadband access to the internet. You can start to create that aggregate social value when they get their first phone. And this has enormous ramifications for building out services like this one. And the third thing I want to call your attention to is this. The hard challenge, as I've said, with Ushahidi was not building out the technology. The hard challenge was not technology design. The hard challenge was opportunity design. Right? Because they didn't just have to make this tool available. They actually had to reach their potential users with a plausible promise, with a message that said, if you do this, a good thing will happen. And opportunity design has been so overlooked in the use of these tools. We often want to believe that the tools are magic pixie dust. If you sprinkle some social technology on a problem, it will evaporate, it will dissolve on contact. But in fact, what Ushahidi shows us is that getting the opportunity design right turns out to be one of the really essential design disciplines. So, what resources are common to these stories, to Nisha Susan in Mangalore, to DARPA finding the red balloons, to Aurea Cohen, Eric Hirschman, and David Kobe, and Juliana Rotich launching Ushahidi? And my answer to that question is something I'm calling cognitive surplus, which is the cumulative free time and talents of the world's population, coupled with social networked tools that allow us to address those free time and talents cumulatively. It's that pair of things, the human characteristic of us having things we're interested in, good at, care about, that we can commit even a little bit of our time to, coupled with a network that allows us to coordinate that participation. So if this is a new resource, if this is a resource we can take advantage of, how big is it? So I needed some way to talk about it, some way to compare it. And I started here with Wikipedia, the largest joint collaborative project any of us have any regular experience with. Started by asking how much time and effort went into Wikipedia. So with my friend Martin Wattenberg, studied Wikipedia first at IBM and he's now at Google. We came up in 2008 with a back-of-the-envelope calculation. Wikipedia had taken something like 100 million hours to create, 100 million hours of human thought. Every edit on every page in every language, every argument on every talk page. All of that cumulatively added up to about this. It's a rough calculation, but it's the right order of magnitude. So that's a big number. Any effort that takes 100 million hours to accomplish is obviously an enormous human achievement. But how big is that relative to the overall pool of free time and talents? So I needed to compare this to something, and I used television. Number one use of free time worldwide. So imagine a graphic representation of television. Right? Wikipedia took 100 million hours. How much television watching is there? 200 billion hours in the United States alone every year. Rendered graphically, Wikipedia is there. The entire Wikipedia project is a rounding error on a single year's television watching in a single country. To put that another way, in my home country, in the United States, we spend a Wikipedia project's worth of time every weekend just watching ads. This is an enormous surplus. And what this means is we don't have to posit some kind of participatory age of Aquarius where everybody stops consuming any kind of media altogether. All we need to imagine is that some people start doing something other than consuming some of the time. Because the cumulative resource is so enormous that as we move from a media environment almost entirely given over to consumption, the 20th century environment, to a media environment that includes consumption, production, and sharing, even small changes in people's behavior can lead to enormous changes in outcome. So this can lead to incredible scientific, literary, artistic, and political achievements of the highest sort. It can also lead, as you see, to lots and lots of lolcats. Lolcats are cute pictures of cats made cuter with the addition of cute captions. And lolcats are also a product of the cognitive surplus because it's what people are doing with their free time. And when you advance the thesis that the internet might be good for society, the reaction you often get is, what, you mean the thing with the cats? Like that's going to be the thing that changes the way the world works? But here's the thing. That always happens. And I don't just mean it always happens with the internet. I mean that always happens when the media landscape changes. After the invention of the printing press, it did not take long for people to start producing erotic novels. Once you had someone who had a financial incentive to sell lots of copies of books, it did not take long for someone to say, hey, you know what I bet people would pay for? It took another 150 years to even think of the scientific journal. So the sacred printing press, the thing we're used to being the bedrock of the media environment that has defined the Western world, did not start serious. Right? It got serious, and again, I want to echo Don's point of earlier this morning about this is what we make it. It got serious because people decided to try and take it and use it in that way. We got erotic novels because we're the kind of people we are, and the printing press is the kind of invention it is. We didn't get scientific journals until a group of people sat down and said, we are going to take these tools and turn them into something that actually improves the way knowledge is spread through the world. We get lolcats because we're the kind of people we are, and the web is the kind of medium it is. But we only get things like ushahidi when people like Oriocola say, I'm going to take these tools that are already lying around, and I'm going to recast the opportunity around them so that people can see the social benefits of this stuff. Right? Which means it falls not to the techies, but to the people who want to rethink how society can be. It falls to us to figure out how to articulate the value of this medium. So let me tell you a story about collaboration, because this is, I think, the piece, as Don and Anthony both emphasized this morning, this is the piece where we can see both the most progress and the most promise, which is to say it's the piece where we can see how much more value there is yet to be gotten. And the ability to bring people together around a subject they care about and to have them make progress together is turning out to be nothing short of astonishing. So here's a small example drawn from the annals of technology, because it's often the techies who understand and use these patterns first. This is a site called Stack Overflow. It's a place where programmers gather to talk about programming and to talk about programming problems they face. This is not a come here and learn programming, and this is not a here's a reference work on programming. These are working programmers building large-scale, real-world projects who say, hey, I've run into this problem. What's the best way to do this? So in this particular case, there are some questions here about a programming language called C#, which Microsoft invented some years ago, and it's a very popular programming language, particularly in large enterprises. And here's a question from the C# area, and you can see it quite detailed as a programmer can be in talking to another programmer. Here is what I want to do. I'm working off of a database, and I want to make sure that I have access to the variables. So this was posted a few days ago. The first answer came in 11 minutes later and solved the original question asker's problem. The next answer came in 9 minutes after that and said, yes, the original answer will solve your problem locally, but the right answer, the real way to do it, is this, and laid out a much more detailed answer. The entire transaction done in half an hour. And if you go to the Stack Overflow site, you can see that a lot of other people are watching this question, which is to say they don't have this problem directly, but they're learning from watching the experts do what they do. Right. Now, the remarkable thing about this conversation is that this is not on a site owned by Microsoft. But it is entirely about technology that's invented by Microsoft. In fact, many of the people who hang out on Stack Overflow are Microsoft employees. So what could the people on Stack Overflow possibly have access to that the people who invented and own the programming language don't have access to? And the answer is, we have access to reality. Right? The number of people trying to do something complicated in the real world is so large, and the complexities are so large. I'm trying to take this particular piece of software and connect it to that particular database under these particular conditions, are so large that Microsoft can never, ever, for any budget, emulate the real world inside its four walls. And this is one of the huge organizational shifts. It is both one of the big opportunities and one of the hardest things for organizations to adapt to, which is the cumulative intelligence about your subject outside your organization is almost certainly larger than the cumulative intelligence inside your organization. Not because you've hired dumb people, and not because you're not doing the best job you can, but because the complexity of the real world defeats your ability to model it inside, to understand what's going on. And when you see sites like Stack Overflow that set themselves up to answer questions that draw on people who have access to reality, you see why this is complementary to what Microsoft is doing with C#. Because Microsoft can't make reality go away, and they can't model reality inside their firewall. Right? And it's turned out that this pattern has been repeated over and over and over. What Jeff Atwood and Joel Spolsky realized, the designers of the system realized, is that this pattern, can we gather people together and ask them to answer one another's questions, right, has been repeated numbers of times. Many of these things are technical, but some of them are starting not to be. Right? There's something up there. There's a Stack Exchange site, as these are called, for photography. There's one for using WordPress. There's one for the usage of the English language. The pattern turns out to be surprisingly general. Right? And when you look at this, it's easy to ask yourself, well, why are all these people working for free? Right? And the answer is, it doesn't feel like work when they're doing it for each other. And this has turned out to be one of the really big surprises of the present age. It's not just the kinds of examples that I've used in Here Comes Everybody in Cognitive Surplus, the kind of examples that Anthony and Don used in Wikinomics and Super Wikinomics. We're, at the same time as we're seeing people do these things in the real world, we're also getting the social science that's explaining why this change is happening. And one of the hardest things to explain, based on the way we viewed the world in the 20th century, is why are people cooperating with one another in what seem like transactional situations? I'm asking for advice, somebody else is coming and giving advice on Stack Overflow. Isn't that a job? Why are these people behaving this way if they're not getting paid? So this is a slide from the work that I think goes furthest to explaining this question. This is taken from a paper by Yuri Nisi and Alfredo Rusticini called A Fine as a Price. And Nisi and Rusticini set out to explore the question, what happens when you fine people? Does the behavior you want them to stop engaging in, does it go down? Can you control people's behavior by punishing, right? Now, the straightforward and commonsensical answer is yes, but that had been largely untested. So Nisi and Rusticini set out to test it. So they picked a class of institutions where there was an underspecified contract, and they decided to see what would happen if they specified. And these institutions were daycare centers in Tel Aviv. They took 10 daycare centers in Tel Aviv. And the first thing they did was they divided them into two groups, the group marked in black there and the group marked in white, and they studied them for 5 weeks. You can see the 5 across the bottom of the screen there. And they studied these daycare centers at the moment of highest tension, which is pickup time. Because at pickup time, the teachers would like you to be there to get your little darlings, as they have been with your children all day. And you might want a little slack. You're at work, you're running an errand, traffic, whatever. You might want a little slack to pick your kid up late. So Nisi and Rusticini just said, how many times a week at these daycare centers is there a late pickup? And in the two different groups, as you can see, the answer was there's between half a dozen and a dozen incidents of late pickups in any given week. So then they said, all right, we are going to change that behavior as of right now. Right? We are adding a fine to the contract to the daycare centers represented by the black line. They said, if you pick your kid up more than 10 minutes late, 10 shekel fine added to your bill, no ifs, ands, or buts. And the minute they changed the contract, the behavior at those daycare centers changed. Late pickups went up every week for the next 5 weeks until they topped out at triple the pre-fine average, and then bounced it between double and triple the pre-fine average for the remainder of the experiment. And you can see immediately what happened. Money broke the culture. The idea that we operated under in the 20th century was that people were rational, calculating, self-interested actors. So if something like late pickups was not specified in the contract, it wasn't specified anywhere. But Nisi and Rusticini showed that this was not true. In addition to whatever contractual arrangement there was between the teachers and students, there was also a sense of shared mission, shared purpose, even in the context of a commercial enterprise. And when they added the fine, what they communicated to the parents was, this is now a fee-for-service transaction. Right? Once you've paid your 10 shekels, your obligation is discharged. To which the parents said, quite reasonably, 10 shekels to pick my kid up late. What could be bad? So they ran this experiment for 12 weeks. Then they said, okay, thank you very much. Thank you for participating in an experiment. As you were, we're canceling that change in the contract. And then a really interesting thing happened. Nothing changed. The culture that got broken stayed broken. And this, I think, is the most essential thing to understand, that even in transactional environments, not only is there some cultural residue in the way people deal with each other, but it is possible through the behavior of the organization to make that behavior worse. And because it is organic, if you remove the thing that caused the problem, you will not necessarily get back to the culture you want. Right? Which means that anyone who deals with groups of customers, users, citizens also has to treat them as groups of people and to assume that there is some set of relationships among them that has to be taken into account in addition. So let me end with one last story that I think demonstrates how dramatic this shift can be when we rethink problems that we regarded as being significant and possibly even intractable in the 20th century. Once we say, there's new ways to solve these problems, let's try some of them. We'll start here. A site called Patients Like Me. And the site, as you might expect from a name like that, aggregates patients who share a particular syndrome. They concentrate a lot on chronic or degenerative diseases, ALS, diabetes, bipolar illness. And they generate an enormous amount of data from these patient pools. Right? They have patient pools that are much larger and much more detailed than the ones that pharmaceutical companies often use in their clinical trials. And the data, amazingly, is all self-reported. So they're able to get things from the users like, sorry, I'm not getting my next slide. There we go. They're able to get things from the users, not just, I'm a 23-year-old male and I have type 2 diabetes. They're able to get, here's my diagnosis, here's my symptoms, here's what I've been prescribed, here's the dose, here's the side effects. Right? This chart at the bottom here, this is a histogram of the number of patients taking not just a particular drug for a particular condition, taking a particular drug for a particular condition at a particular dose. This is data that the pharmaceutical companies have spent an enormous amount of money to try and produce, and they often have it at much less granular detail and with smaller patient pools than patients like me is producing. But that's not the only thing that happens on patients like me. Right? There's also stuff like this. There's forums, there's bulletin boards on the site where the users who are there to provide their medical information can also talk to each other. So here's something that appeared on the bulletin board about 4 years ago. It's called the Vent-Event Vent thread. It started in 2008. And you can guess what's in the Vent-Event Vent thread. It started by somebody who said, I just need to vent. And this is, of course, a need for patients, particularly patients with degenerative or chronic illness, because it's so often what they don't get from the medical systems they participate in, which is just someone to listen, someone to say, I'm sorry you're not feeling well. I hope you're feeling better tomorrow. I hope when you go to the doctor next week that they're able to tell you something. I hope there are some drugs that work for you. People who are just ready to listen. So the Vent-Event Vent thread started in 2008. It is still going this year, which is to say 5 uninterrupted years of people going onto the site to vent. And it's easy to see how to improve patients like me as a source for medical data, which is more of that stuff where you told us your medications and dosages and less of this stuff over here with the venting. Right? Because that's not adding to anybody's store of medical knowledge, and this is a serious medical site. But if you did that, it wouldn't work, and in fact, it would kill the site, and here's why. When you go and you look at people's profiles, the people who are actually logging in and voluntarily offering up their medical details so that in aggregate people can get better, you see things like this. This is a user named Babsy who has provided almost 4,000 posts in the forums and has been voted helpful over 1,000 times by her fellow users. They're not collecting the medical details despite the fact that people are hanging out on the Vent-Event Vent thread. They're collecting medical details because people are hanging out on the Vent-Event Vent thread. And this is the big change in design. Access to reality used to be limited to what an organization or an institution could model on the inside based on inputs it could observe. And so you would develop inside any organization a mental picture of the world. It was a tiny, highly groomed subset of what was really going on. Access to reality has now expanded enormously. We can go to the people who are actually out in the world, and we can ask them questions, we can let them coordinate with each other, we can observe, we can participate, we can interact. But doing that requires a big mental shift. It requires organizations that care about any individuals outside of their own firewalls. Not just to treat those people like consumers anymore, or users or citizens, but also to treat them as participants. And to understand that it isn't just the transactional piece that's going to get them to come, that's going to get them to participate. It's also this ability to offer a plausible promise. It's the ability to say, if you come and you help us, and we all work together, a good thing will happen. Thank you very much.